Thank you. I'll serve as moderator for this session. My name is Kawashima. This session 2 takes up Northeast Asia. This book consists of 3 volumes. As Professor Tanaka said at the outset, the first volume covers international relations, second, Northeast Asia, and the third, Southeast Asia. And volume 2 and 3 actually divide international relations into countries and how modern state building was done in each country is covered. And why this region succeeded in economic growth. And from 1980s, in other words, after the war, actually after a series of war, there's a prosperity in this country and there's a diverse political systems in this region. Now, regarding Northeast Asia, Japan and China and the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan and Hong Kong were covered. Because Hong Kong, we take up Hong Kong and Southeast Asia because of a colony experience. Today, Professor Hatano, who covered Japan, and Professor Kimiya, who covered Korea, and Professor Kurata, who covered Hong Kong. I was in charge of Hong Kong, and in particular Taiwan, so I will actually serve as moderator for this session. As Professor Tanaka pointed out at the outset, and having that in mind, and the experience of state building in each country, if there have been any critical junctures, I would like you to point that out, keeping that in mind. And I hope you will report on what points you paid particular attention. And Professor Hatano, Professor Kurata, and Mr. Kimiya, in that order, the presentations will be given. Now, Professor Hatano. Can you hear me? My name is Hatano. I will give a brief report. I did not know how many minutes I was given, so I put 2-page resume. Can you show my resume on the screen? Yes. So I wrote a long resume because I thought I had more time to speak. But today, instead of the content of this paper, I would discuss certain points. And I would also add the points that I did not write. I was in charge of Showa till the present and how nation building was done. 1989 establishment of imperial constitution, and the 100 years after that, where the LDP started the political reforms. How party politics developed will be explained. First, 10 years after the establishment of imperial constitution, party politics took hold. It was rather quick. And after 30 years, multi-party system took root. Because of international relations uproars and internal and external crisis, actually it was influenced, but finally a parliamentary cabinet system was established, and in 1990s there was a look at the two-party systems, and for that electoral system was actually changed. So the several points I would like to issue is that first, from the end of 19th century toward the beginning of 20th century, not only Japan but China and Korea. Well, in case of Korea, it's Chosen and Korea, except the period of annexation. Those three countries actually aimed at establishing constitutionalism. But it ended up in a rule by high-handed authority, after all. And why did it happen? There are several researches on this point, especially in case of China. There was a major political changes in the 20th century, and at a time they groped for multi-party system. But after all, the constitutionalism did not take root. And the reason for this was, so far, the prestige of the central government was not established, and legislature's authority was strong, and the cabinet, or a body which corresponds to cabinet, was rather weak. Those were pointed out as a reason so far. But the reason that, but in Japan as well, the status of cabinet was rather unstable and weak. But in case of Japan, striking a delicate balance between monarchy and parliament, constitution was applied, and it resulted in the settlement. It resulted in constitutionalism. Actually, party politics was the one who was responsible for this role of applying constitutionalism. So my first point is maybe establishment of multi-party system which respect diverse people's will was the cause for success and failure of different countries in applying constitutionalism. The second point is, once in Japan, multi-party system was suspended, but after 1 year it was regained, and the parliamentary system lasted before and after the war. Because the role of the lower house to represent the people's will was not lost. And instead of actually, Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro said he would like to work with the diet, which is very important in terms based on constitution, which represents will of the people. So instead of invoking emergency prerogative, he actually opted for that road. And instead of, actually, it established the Wartime Emergency Measures Commission consisting of the members of both houses to ensure raison d'etre of the diet. And the significance of the Diet was not lost. Even wartime, idea to defend parliamentary system and party system and the right spirit of the imperial constitution is revert to party politics took hold among the consciousness of politicians. And that was succeeded by later politicians. The third point is the significance of multi-party system, in particular two-party system. There are various types of cabinet or political systems, but partially influenced by internal and external environment, but those alternative political systems other than party system was avoided because predictability of next generation was lost. In other words, this shows the importance of ensuring transparency of governance. And this is true before and after the war. In other words, the transparency of governance has been important, and it was actually in place. The fourth point I would like to point out is that a very maybe naive question: why new constitution was not revised? There are various opinions regarding the reasons. One point I would like to pay attention to is flexibility of a parliamentary cabinet system. Mr. Gotoda said, in short, he was in charge of the administrative reform in Nakasone administration, and he said even under the new constitution, as long as we have the right talent, the leadership of the Prime Minister can be exerted fully. In other words, the leadership of strengthening of the leadership of a Prime Minister does not have to be done by changing the system, but rather by Prime Minister exerting influence over the governance structure beyond the legal authority. There were times when we had coalition cabinet, and minority ruling party cabinet. But as long as we take this parliamentary cabinet system, only when there's a single majority ruling party cabinet, political initiative will move from the Diet to the cabinet. And together with other constitutional stipulations, even though there isn't a system, by applying the system we have, we can achieve the purpose. And this was actually shown in the strengthening of a cabinet function in 1999. In other words, without revising the constitution, to a certain degree or to a great degree, a parliamentary cabinet system could be achieved. And the last point is, what is desirable vision or image of political parties? After 1990s, political reforms started from solving the issue of politics and money but it was based on the recognition that to establish political leadership which can adapt to changes of a post-Cold War international environment was essential. And this 1990s political reform achieved some results, like getting rid of the so-called tribe members and establishment of a leadership or initiative by politics. But actually, party politics vision, which is expected of a parliamentary cabinet system and single-seat electoral system, have not been shared by the members of both houses. So I think we can say that the reform is on the way. And the role required of party politics is to make decisions with the transparency of governance, so that it can adapt to changing international environment. So this governance of transparency of governance, this idea was a basis, and it was well understood. That is why Japan, under the constitutionalism and the parliamentary cabinet system, it was successful in having stable political system. And what Professor Tanaka said, the peace in 1980s, I did not write much about this issue, but 1980s or the end of 1970s, there have been various attempts to, such as international cooperation, so that it will contribute to the stability of Asia and to stop wars in this region. And I think that helped to stop wars in this region. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Hatano. So this was about the modern political history, and China is in perspective, and you also touched on the Constitution. So now we would like to go on to Professor Kimiya, please. Can you hear me? So let me start. Along with the worsening of Japan-ROK relationship in recent years, it seems that negative evaluation concerning the changes in society accompanying South Korea's development since its founding in 1998 and the evolution of Japan-South Korean relationship is gaining force in Japan. In other words, despite achieving economic development and political democratization, the present problems in Korea, politics and foreign affairs and society are especially emphasized to try to partly find the cause of the worsening of the Japan-South Korean relationship. Of course, it is a fact that the deterioration of Japan-South Korean relations is becoming almost a constant issue, and I do not deny at all that part of the cause is the Korean government's policy toward Japan and Korean society's view of Japan. However, in the background is South Korea's economic development and political democratization. Through the involvement of Japan mainly in economic cooperation, Japan-South Korean relations have changed from an asymmetric and complementary one to a symmetric and competitive one. So there is a structural change in the bilateral relationship. In this point, actually, my book on the history of Japan and South Korea relations will be published in 2 days' time. So I hope you can refer to it. Of course, if such a future could be known in advance, an extreme argument saying Japan should not have cooperated with South Korea may appear. However, that is quite extreme and merely advice in retrospect. In fact, Japan expected South Korea to be a bulwark against the communism, and South Korea, which had initially been behind in the regime competition with North Korea, secured an overwhelming advantage through economic development and political democratization. So the common objective of Japan and South Korea to secure Japanese security had been completely attained. Sorry, the slides are not going forward. Is it going forward? So the paper on which the book is based aims to elucidate the process of development in South Korea, which is one factor bringing about the structural change in Japan-South Korea relations, in particular by comparing South Korea with North Korea, which is also a divided state and which engaged in fierce regime competition during the Cold War. Emerging from Japanese rule and following division and occupation by the Soviet Union, South Korea and North Korea competed, first of all, over which would thoroughly achieve decolonization. However, both faced the dilemma of having to partially use the Japanese colonial state to advance decolonization. And it is true that the Japanese colonial state had the nature of being a security police state repressing anti-Japan independence movements, but it also had the nature of an entrepreneurial state to promote government-led industrialization in Korea, in the sense of actually promoting industrialization to use Korea as a logistics base for the invasion into the northeastern part of China. And so there was a need to use, to an extent, this entrepreneurial state. Looking at the result, in the formal decolonization of severing colonial rule, North Korea may have taken a slight lead, but in particular, many political and economic elites in South Korea were also the elites during the colonial period, so there was continuity, while in the case of North Korea, such continuity was not conspicuous. However, South Korea becoming an industrialized nation, in conclusion, it is not overstating to say that South Korea was the one which succeeded in decolonization. In other words, Japan and Korea had an asymmetric relationship as ruler and ruled. But now, after more than 75 years, a symmetric and even a complementary relationship is seen. This is also a clear illustration of South Korea having made a great success in terms of decolonization. And still, there is dwelling by South Korea on the illegality of colonial rule. So perhaps South Korea's own self-evaluation of decolonization is not very high. In a sense, the illegality of the colonial rule being admitted by Japan may perhaps be the completion, or maybe there are two aspects. Secondly, as an important factor bringing about the development of South Korea, at least up until the 1980s, the government, in particular, the role that the Park Chung-hee administration played as an entrepreneur should be emphasized. North Korea, as a result of the party stressing ideology occupying the state of the party as the state, did not succeed in grasping the opportunity for development due to an intentional emphasis on self-reliance and heavy and chemical industries in its policy choices. And it is true that until the 1950s, North Korea was more successful in post-war reconstruction, but it didn't last. One of the reasons is the emphasis on ideology in the choice of their economic policies. In comparison, in South Korea, the government and not the parties set the practical targets to prioritize economic development and chose to secure an economic advantage in the regime competition with North Korea. Having said that, that was not the choice from the start. For example, during the Ri-Syngman administration in the 1950s, economic cooperation between Japan and South Korea was not emphasized due to the focus on economic interdependence from Japan. That is, it was the ruling party that was superior in the 1950s, and then in the 1960s, there was the military coup d'etat in 1961 and the grasp of power. And originally, the government led the basic industry, such as heavy and chemical industry construction. However, this ambition plan was not realized, and therefore, the labor-intensive light industry utilizing the conditions in South Korea was chosen, and that led the economic development after that time. But it was important that they had such an orientation initially, and the industrialization of Korea after the 1960s saw a dual-track type of development of export-oriented light industries and import substitution. Substituting heavy and chemical industries from the middle of 1960s, and led by the government, the drive for heavy and chemical industries after the 1970s was seen. And then there is liberalization and stabilization of the economy under the Chun Doo-hwan administration. And then in 1990s, the conservative administration promotes the globalization of the economy. However, in that process, in dealing with the globalization, there is economic liberalization, which is, and then the government-led development, and then there is the Asian currency crisis. So paradoxically, it is the neoliberalistic policies of introducing market mechanism in a full-fledged manner into labor management relations by the progressive liberalism administration, which was quite socialistic in its orientation. And so in this way, in the response to the global economy and to respond to crisis, although there were some factors of chance, there was a realization of a change in political regime and change in government, and through such political changes, it made possible the change in policies as well as the choice of appropriate policies. And also, a change in government makes difficult the consistent selection of policies, and it might be negative to economic development. However, in the case of South Korea, especially after democratization, because there was political change, it was possible to change policies, and with that, economic performance making sustainable development possible was realized. And lastly, through economic development, South Korea achieved the objective of winning the regime competition, or because of the achievement is forced to navigate extremely difficult situation. What will be the next direction? In particular, how will it respond to the flood of society's diverse demands? How will it use superior economic power to realize the unification of the peninsula? What policies towards North Korea will it select? And to gain the cooperation of the international community, what kind of diplomacy will it deploy? In particular, on the one hand, expectation towards the government for welfare and the blood friends will rise along with democratization, but on the other hand, South Korea faces the reality of declining birth rate and aging of the population, progressing at a pace unparalleled in the world. And it is expected that the demands for welfare is going to rise in the future, and it will be the aging of the active working force. And we saw development proceed in a compressed manner, and as for the welfare too, it will be forced to proceed in a compressed manner. And in terms of North Korea, what kind of frontier will be provided to South Korea in the economic integration with the North, or will there be a bigger burden on the South? And South Korea wants unification led by South Korea. But on the other hand, how is it going to integrate the dissimilar regime, which is North Korea, and also realize the welfare state in line with being a developed nation? And how will both coexist? This is a very difficult challenge. And facing such issues, will there be a political change that will make possible the new policy choices? We need to watch this closely. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Professor Kimiya. And this is about South Korea and North Korea both. And then since the independence in 1948, you followed up on the history. There is the political regime, and also we talk about the Japan-Korea relationship, but going from a symmetrical relationship to symmetrical relationship was shown. Thank you very much. Now going on to Hong Kong.
Thank you for introduction. I am Kurata of the St. Paul University. I was in charge of writing the history of Hong Kong. As a part of such a huge project, I would say Hong Kong is quite exceptional given the small size, and yet I'm very much grateful for inviting me as a part, the member of this team. And here I'd like to talk about who created Hong Kong as a part of history of nation building. Well, this project is to describe nation building history in East Asia during 20th century. Well, Hong Kong used to be the colony of the UK and now special administration region, and it has no experience of becoming independent as a nation, and therefore whether it is possible to write a nation building history of Hong Kong. If we take a narrow definition of writing the nation-building history as dealing with the history of the nation-state, then Hong Kong is not qualified to be the subject of the nation-building history. And yet, regardless of whether it is before or after handover, it enjoyed the autonomy and the exercise a kind of the autonomy in a unique way, and therefore they have a special identity and system, and therefore they experience something like a pseudo nation building, and therefore I decided to write down the nation building history of Hong Kong in a broad sense as the history of uniqueness of Hong Kong. At first, we have to consider who is in charge of nation building at present, because Hong Kong is the special administration region. It has to be China, and also the basic law of the Hong Kong is the Chinese law, and historically China, the Hong Kong was a part of China, and therefore, and the Chinese tradition is the foundation of Hong Kong society and culture. On the other hand, under the one country, two systems, the current Hong Kong system actually originates from British system. And therefore, it was British that created the political regime and legal system of Hong Kong. Therefore, the British could be considered as the party to nation building, and they played an important role in creating Hong Kong that we see today. Yet, Hong Kong is not something like adding China and UK and divided by two. Rather, the grassroots people has been there, where they acted as a bridge between China and the British and the world. And from time to time, they cooperated, opposed against the political economic power, thereby creating the unique economy, society, and culture. In other words, Hong Kong has a history where no major actor, the state actor, was monopolizing the power. Therefore, it is suzerain state or the country with a blood relationship. No country has ever controlled entire Hong Kong society and remodeled it. And therefore, it is cosmopolitan Hong Kong that has been created by the interaction of different kinds of people. And therefore, in writing down the nation-building history of Hong Kong, because time is limited, I'd like to talk more about the change of the power and the roles of different countries. by classifying the time into three major periods. One under the UK and until the World War II, and then the Cold War period and the handover. In the first period, it was the British that was mainly responsible for nation building. From the time of the cession of the Hong Kong Island, cession of Kowloon Peninsula, and the lease of the new territories, they defined the territory of Hong Kong and developed political regime and attracted people, goods, and money to become the major free port and the trade center. At the same time, they treated the Chinese people in a discriminate manner and excluded them from the power, and only elites were part of the structure. On the other hand, the interaction between Hong Kong and the continent was free, and therefore Hong Kong was a part of Chinese society. There were Western culture-related the assets like the churches and schools, and at the same time, those places acted as an important place for modernizing the China. And also because it was under the ruling by the British, the Sun Yat-sen, Zhou Enlai, and other people that were in charge of the revolution sought for refugee, as a refugee coming to Hong Kong, and also from 1925 to 1926, there was a strike raised against the British under cooperation with the Guangdong province, and Song Jinling in 1938 created the China Defense League and resistance against Japan. And on the other hand, during that time, the Chinese people in Hong Kong started to be somewhat unique, and at the same time, there were people there who were living on the boat or as who acted as a comprador, and some of them accumulated their wealth and honor and became the leader of the society, and they took a different attitude than the nationalism China. For instance, some of them cooperated with the UK to stand against a strike raised against the UK, and therefore that's how the identity of Hong Kong was created, where different the contradicting value systems coexisted. Then during the Cold War, then we saw the change in the influence of the power from outside. In the post-colony period, Hong Kong was separated from the mainland, and then it started to be dependent militarily on the United States. And the United States saw Hong Kong as the forefront against the Cold War. And at the same time, in view of the military threat from China, the government of Hong Kong, SAR, started to work together with the United States. And thus, at the same time, within Hong Kong, the communist the regime of Beijing and Kuomintang and Taipei both developed different riots and terrorism. And under such circumstances, the policies by the UK was to be neutral by taking a certain distance from any forces. And thus, they created the ideology that was different from China. However, after handover, as such, the nature of Hong Kong is about to be transformed completely. After handover, the China used to be interested in maintaining the system that Hong Kong inherited from UK to enjoy economic benefits. However, they could not tolerate the value system from the UK, and therefore they started to view it as the threat against the national security. In other words, the Chinese way of ruling started to spread within Hong Kong. At the same time, we saw the resistance and opposition among Hong Kong citizens in 2019. At the time of the extradition bill, there was a very strong resistance, which was viewed as a threat against a one country, two system. Therefore, in view of that, Beijing decided to introduce Hong Kong national security law in 2020 to put Hong Kong completely its economy and society, and therefore the different kinds of media, the less restricted internet, and the legal system or jurisprudence that was originated from the Western countries, freedom of education and research, and the market free for access by anyone. The elements are disappearing very rapidly. In other words, nation building of Hong Kong is about to be changed to be undertaken by China. In other words, now Hong Kong is faced with a major turning point of the time. Thank you. Well, it may be rather difficult to use the nation-building history in describing Hong Kong, and yet you shared with us how the Hong Kong developed. Thank you very much. It is 3:30.
According to the scenario, it should be 3:20, so we had 10 minutes over time. I'm supposed to make comments in this session, so I will make a comment and ask questions to 3 professors and receive answers from the floor. You can ask questions on the question and answer that will start from 3:40. So the question and answer, entertaining question and answer from the floor will start at 3:40. Thank you very much for the speeches. I discussed China I was in charge of Taiwan with 2 Chinese professors, and how China's state building and governance was actually carried out. That's what I wrote. There were 2 major points in China. What sort of governance structure was thought desirable, and what sort of governance structure was adopted? That's the first point. And in power in each time, to what extent they wanted to go into national authority from sovereignty from a Qing dynasty to the present. There were different regimes and systems. Constitutional monarchy or republicanism. There were 2 major points. In other words, whether it's a centralization or decentralization that can be translated into that. In the Chinese Revolution, Yuan Shikai had a tendency for centralized system. And diet was too strong. So Yuan Shikai wanted to become emperor and wanted to govern. But it is that presidency was too weak. And that is why Yuan Shikai wanted to become emperor. The diet or the assembly was too strong. So it's a constitutional monarchy versus Republican system. In China right now, it's centralized. It has a centralized, a strong leader, and it has a Republican system. So no matter what sort of form the government takes, I think the situation was the same for Yuan Shikai and Mao Zedong. So there's a conflict between the center and the regions. And there's a strife between those 2, and then the warlord actually dominates. If the central government has strong power, it's going to be a centralized country, but it didn't take And in the Qin dynasty, they wanted to exert governance to regions, to provinces, and to villages and towns. But it was difficult to actually exert influence over smaller units of administration. So that was what I wrote. And now, based on this, what can we discuss? As Kurata, I wanted to ask Kurata Sensei. This is not directly addressed to the presentation by Professor Kurata, but in Hong Kong. Hong Kong and Kuala and Shenzhen is actually leased land, right? So in Shinkai, they have different laws to abide by from Kulon people. So what's the nationality of Shinkai and Shenzhen? There's a border between Shinkai and Shanghai, Shenzhen, and people can actually freely move. So to what extent it was governed by British, and what sort of nationality each region's people belong to is quite blurred. Of course, people can swim from the mainland to Hong Kong in order to cross the border. So who is the constituent of Hong Kong governance? And what is the British territory? And this is new territories. And people immigrating to this new territories. And another question is to Professor Kimiya. In case of Taiwan, maybe this is a separate section in my chapter, but divided the country. As Professor Tanaka said, around 1980s, there was an issue of post-war and peace. We said that in 1945 in Japan, but 1980s, around 1980s is the time when the time of peace came. But how should we understand Korea? 1953, there was a truce. Which year was the start of becoming peaceful and economic growth? In case of Taiwan, in 1960s, there was a strengthening of the governance, but in 1979, the U.S. Army actually withdrew from Taiwan, and at the beginning of 1990, in other words, the peace came around. So, in parallel to this Taiwan's issue, how should we understand the start of Korean Peninsula becoming peaceful? Professor Hatano, thank you very much for a very clear-cut speech. One thing I would like to ask was, it's a kind of might be off the point. In Potsdam Declaration, democratic elements should be regained, regained in Japan after the war. That's one clause in the declaration. Taisho democracy and liberal democratic movement. There's the past thought in Japan, which was actually there from the beginning, and then there's another pressure from the U.S. for democratization, and how they actually mingle, merge, I would like to know. We talked about the parliamentary cabinet system. and party politics, but how are they intertwined with emperor system? And of course, in case of China, there's a top leader issue, and the similar things in Taiwan, but those are the questions. We haven't received any questions from the floor, so I would like to get answers from Kurata Sensei, Kimiya Sensei, and Hatano Sensei. Kurata Sensei, thank you very much. New territories, people in new territories are quite special. It's not just a simple bed town. I hope you have to understand this, because I would not go into details, but there's a Hong Kong island and actually secession of Hong Kong island and Kowloon. In case of new territories, there was a war with the UK. And renowned family were actually promoted to the top positions in that region. So native people who lived in Hong Kong, many of them willingly came under the rule of the UK. But in case of new territories, they became under the British rule without noticing it. So they have different concepts. And in case the influence of the Communist Party of China was actually was spreading in the new territories, there was actually violence by white shirt group at the time of uproars. So what is the origin of Hong Kong people, Hong Kongese? This is an ideological issue. So famed families of new territories are actually succeeding the Chinese route. That's what they would like to think. But mainland pro-mainland people say that people in new territories is not the majority. Actually, poor farmers and people living on the river are the majority of Hong Kong, and this is the root of Hong Kongese. So there are two different opinions. So it's very difficult to write the Hong Kong history.
So who is the Hong Kong people is a big issue, and though this is simple, I'd like to stop here. So, for example, in the history of Taiwan, who are Taiwanese? And when you talk about Taiwan, is it the space by ROC, or are you talking about the Taiwan island itself? That becomes an issue. So who are the Taiwanese people? Are you going to include those from the mainland? And I think depending on the position, the category differs. In other words, if you consider the state, who is governing, it will depend on what space you're talking about. And I think for research on Hong Kong and Taiwan, there are similar issues. Having said that, they are in such different positions, so there are differences. Professor Kimiya, please. Thank you, Professor Kashima, for the important points raised. And I think you know the Korean War. Well, there was an armistice, a peace treaty. A peace treaty is still not concluded, so in the legal sense, it's not a state of peace as yet. However, one, I think, turning point was after the 1970s. Up until that time, compared to North Korea, South Korea was in the inferior position, and so they had the U.S. troops stationed to secure security. And then in the 70s, North-South regime, the resilience of the regime, or with national power, the two sides become relatively even. So after the Korean War, there is a big turning point, and there are North-South dialogues, And then towards 80s, there's also the diplomacy towards the north. And the second turning point is from 1990s to 2000, when the Cold War ends and South Korea normalizes ties with China and Soviet and Russia. So North Korea's regime superiority had become clear. And will there be institutional peaceful coexistence? North Korea resists, and conversely, they develop nuclear missiles, and they involve not South Korea but the United States, and it thinks about the assurance of the North Korean regime only. So from the perspective of South Korea, then, with the intent to be the winner in the regime competition is not readily realized. So it's not so much the military confrontation, but rather asymmetrical military confrontation between U.S. and North Korea is probably more possible. And so the regime competition may have ended, but in another sense, the risk of war still remains. I think that's the situation. Thank you very much. So thinking about the Cold War in East Asia, it's very important. Regime competition may have ended, but there's still a conflict, and that is the underlying factor. Thank you. Now, Professor Hatano, please. I wonder if you can hear me. Yes, we can. When drafting the Potsdam Declaration, as mentioned, we saw resumed resistance, and in Japan, of the four nations signing Potsdam, there was an understanding that why is there two countries being added, and you centering on the U.S., how is their recovery, and what is important when thinking about that? There's the Burns response, and other than Potsdam Declaration, the polity of Japan is going to be entrusted to the people. In other words, they're talking about non-intervention, and if we understand it in that way, since it's non-intervention, that whatever the Japanese polity is, it will be accepted. That is the understanding, so long as there are democratic tendencies. So democracy and the emperor system, how will there be harmony between the two? On the one hand, if you think about non-intervention, the emperor system can be maintained. That would be the prospect. So how can you have harmony with the recovering democratic trend? Ultimately, how there can be harmony between the democracy and the emperor system, there is the civic society and the military, and from the past there has been harmony, and in reconciling the emperor system and democracy. There was such a view in the past. And in this reconciliation, the emperor system is maintained, and the various powers are explained, and the constitutional monarchy is accepted, even if it is centering on the emperor. The form could be constitutional monarchy. Simply put, the rules, the provisions regarding the military can be omitted, and the constitutional monarchy can be maintained. But in 1946 February, the occupied forces rejected this. So under the Potsdam Declaration, constitutional monarchy can be maintained, especially with the provisions about the military. If that is omitted, then if that is eliminated, then at that time in the Nordic countries, they had constitutional monarchies at the time. What was different was the monarch's rule. How is it to be limited? There were differences there, and the role of the military. How is it going to be controlled? So there was a difference there. That is how it was understood. In other words, I'm sorry to go on, but the root of the constitutional monarchy could be maintained even with the Potsdam Declaration. Thank you very much. So thank you for understanding the intent of my question.
Now we have received 4 questions. 8 minutes are left. From now on, I'd like to take up one question after another. First question from Takahashi-san. Dr. Kurata, Hong Kong tends to be treated differently from continent China when it comes to international economy, and the view toward Hong Kong in international order has affected its self-awareness. In what way? The next question is about the news that showed the flag during the colony, British colony, was hoisted during the demonstration, but the freedom was not granted in old days. Today, how the time under British colony is viewed today. First, about the outside evaluation, outside view toward Hong Kong and its influence. That's quite important. WTO, APEC, Olympic Games, Hong Kong is a part of them, and therefore it is treated somewhat similar to the nation. Yet the Hong Kong people focus on international ranking, that is the index of rule of law, the freedom of media, democracy index. Hong Kong is always treated differently from continent China, and their score is higher than continent China, and that seems to be affecting a lot toward the self-awareness of Hong Kong, that they are different from China. And yet there is some contradiction, because the government has to advocate that the Hong Kong is a part of China. Yet when it comes to ranking, they have to assert that Hong Kong is better than China. And according to Heritage Foundation about the freedom economy, for 25 years in a row, Hong Kong was number 1. But last year it was Singapore that was number 1 and Hong Kong was number 2. And now, this year, Hong Kong is excluded from the ranking because now it is under ruling or controlled by China. And therefore, the government of China stated that Hong Kong should be treated separately. although it always insists on Hong Kong being treated as a part of China. So there is a kind of contradiction even at the government level. And the next question by Matsuo-san, that is about during the British colony, there was freedom, but democracy was limited. That is true. Well, during the demonstration, it is democracy that is considered as an important value, at least officially. But for Hong Kong people, I think it is freedom that is given the utmost priority. When you look at what is chanted by the demonstrators, you see the value that Hong Kong people consider as important. Democracy is considered as a tool to protect freedom. Thank you. Now, Dr. Hajano, please. That is about the history of Hong Kong and Korea that used to be ruled. And similarly, Japan has a history of being occupied by the United States. And how do you view the occupation by U.S. and China and its impact to the history of Japan afterwards? Dr. Hatano, am I supposed to answer that question? Yes, please. U.S. occupation of Japan, how it is viewed in a historical context. I may have to dwell upon for long, but simply put, in the case of Korea, it was also under the ruling of the U.S. forces. But in the case of Japan, as you may know, it was indirect control ruling. Initially, the policy was about direct control, but it was around the Potsdam Declaration that that provision was changed to become indirect ruling or control. And as a result, the U.S. forces came to Japan and did nothing. It was not always the case. As a result of indirect ruling for Japan, that was to the advantage of Japan because the various development since the time of Taisho democracy, like women's suffrage, the reform of farmland, and so on, which were in preparation since 1920s, they were reinstated as a result. And also, how to evaluate the ruling or occupation by the U.S. forces, we can't talk about that without talking about Okinawa. For Okinawa, such ruling continued to stay. And in fact, even today, although it is now part of Japan from a legal point of view, yet as a question of the lost territory, the Okinawa started to be treated between Japan and the United States. And as a result of the U.S. occupation, I think the impact is most seriously felt in Okinawa. I thank you for your succinct answer. Now, Dr. Kimiya, about Korea. You mentioned about the unification of Korean Peninsula. The Korea tends to be accommodative toward North Korea, but the quite coercive or the quite assertive toward Japan, probably due to domestic factors. But how do you think it could change or evolve? I think you were talking about the Moon Jae-in administration, which is associated with the North Korea friendly regime, but hostile against Japan. When you try to differentiate the conservative versus the hardline, I think it has to do with the policy toward North Korea. When Korea is more confident in terms of their advantage over North Korea, the conservative liberal thinks that they are more advanced than North Korea, so that they are confident enough to accommodate North Korea. Whereas in the case of conservative side, they are quite skeptical about North Korea. They are not so confident about advantage over North Korea. So that is why they tend to emphasize the harmony or friendly approach with North Korea, trying to accommodate them. And some say that the Japan-Korea relationship might improve once the new administration is put in place, replacing Moon Jae-in. That seems to be too optimistic. Everybody knows that it was in 1998 when there was the Japan-Korea Partnership Declaration with Lee Myung-bak president, but in the last year of his presidency, he landed on Takeshima Island, and also in the case of the Park Geun-hye, she was quite hardlined against Japan. She said she was not interested in the Japan-Korea summit meeting unless the comfort women issues resolved, and therefore we shouldn't be too optimistic that the replacement of the administration with a conservative would improve the relationship with Japan. But it is true that the liberal side tends to say that the pro-Japan tradition is still inherited by the conservative. But then whether conservative side is pro-Japan, I would say no, because they are criticized in such a way, and they seem to be somewhat hardline depending on the issues such as historical issues. Therefore, from Japan's point of view, first, historical issues or history issues that has to be handled properly, not to stimulate too much Korea. And for Korean diplomacy, presence of Japan has to be there to convince Korea. In other words, they have to be convinced that if the relationship with Japan deteriorates, then that would be to the disadvantage of Korea as well. By so doing, they would be motivated to improve the relationship with Japan, and therefore, if such development is seen, then the relationship may not deteriorate. Thank you very much. We are already behind the schedule by 3 minutes. In this session, we talked about Northeast Asia to discuss nation-building history. 3 speakers touched on different countries. We saw some similarities as well as differences. Some countries in this region enjoyed independence without experiencing colony, and also the political situation is quite different, as Ishida-san stated, with the nationalism there, whether those countries or states would seek to be the mutually excluding. I don't think so, because of the economic relationship. There are some the causes for confrontation. On the other hand, there are factors as well for mutual dependency, and therefore, as we are living in the age of decoupling, we should be multifaceted in terms of our views looking at those countries. I'm sorry we could not cover all the questions, but time is up. With this, I would like to conclude this session. Dr. Kurata, Dr. Kimiya, Dr. Hatano, thank you very much. Now I'd like to take a break. I understand that the next session starts at 4:10. I'd like to hand over the microphone back to the Secretariat. Thank you very much.